Christopher Nolan opens the Odyssey with a victory Homer never actually shows us. The Trojan Horse enters the city, Greek soldiers crawl from its belly, and Troy burns. But in Homer's surviving poem, that scene never plays out on the page. The horse survives only in songs, in stories told after the fact. Nolan turns it into the wound that poisons everything that follows, because his Odysseus isn't just trying to get home. He's trying to outrun what he did to someone else's. Picture the Greek soldiers sealed inside the Trojan horse. They can barely move. Bronze weapons press against timber, and sweat runs beneath their armor. Outside, the Trojans believe the war is finally over. The Greek ships appear to have sailed away. One man was left behind, Sinon. His job matters more than any battle fought beneath Troy's walls. He has to convince the Trojans that the horse is sacred, that the Greeks abandoned it, that dragging it inside will bring divine protection. The moment Troy accepts the gift, the city is already dead. Nolan puts this deception at the center of his opening movement. It gives Odysseus a clear original sin. He doesn't just survive the Trojan War, he invents the weapon that ends it. Doesn't begin inside the horse. It begins far away, in the palace of Zeus, where the gods are debating Odysseus's fate while he sits trapped on Calypso's island. Athena wants him home. Poseidon wants him punished. Odysseus himself doesn't properly enter the poem until Book 5. The Trojan horse does appear in the Odyssey. Helen and Menelaus remember it. A bard sings of it before Odysseus. But Homer never stages the fall of Troy as a continuous action scene. Nolan does. That difference tells us what each version believes actually drives the story. In Homer, the gods move human lives. In Nolan, one human decision creates consequences that follow Odysseus across the entire sea. Homer's world is crowded with gods. Athena changes appearance, gives advice, strengthens Odysseus, protects Telemachus, and when Ithaca teeters on the edge of civil war, forces the violence to stop. Poseidon wrecks ships and delays the homecoming. Hermes delivers divine commands. Zeus judges disputes from Olympus. Helios demands punishment after Odysseus's crew slaughter his sacred cattle. The gods aren't metaphors in Homer, they're characters. They disagree, they pick favorites, they interfere, and human beings suffer beneath decisions made far above them. Nolan keeps the language of divine punishment, but he leaves most of that machinery unseen. The gods are mentioned, their presence is felt, yet the film keeps another explanation open. Memory, trauma, guilt. Athena becomes the most unsettling example. Odysseus sees her throughout his journey, but her image is tied to a young woman killed during Troy's destruction. So is Athena really following him? Is a goddess forcing him to face what he did? Or has his mind reshaped a murdered victim into the goddess of wisdom? Nolan never fully settles the question. That same uncertainty reshapes Poseidon too. The sea can still read as divine punishment, but it can also be weather, bad navigation, human arrogance, or simply the fact that ancient sailors crossed a world that could kill them without warning. Homer's Odysseus is hunted by a god. Nolan's Odysseus may be hunted by memory, and memory is the more dangerous predator. A storm eventually passes. Guilt can outlast the entire journey. While Odysseus wanders, Ithaca is being eaten from the inside. Penelope has waited almost 20 years, 10 years of war, then roughly 10 more without a confirmed death. No body, no burial, no final message, only rumors. Dozens of noblemen occupy her household. They slaughter the king's animals, drink his wine, and pressure Penelope to choose another husband, understanding exactly what that marriage would mean. Whoever marries Odysseus's queen may inherit his palace, his wealth, his alliances, perhaps even his throne. Antinous becomes the sharpest edge of that threat. He isn't merely competing for Penelope's affection, he's testing how much of the kingdom he can seize before anyone stops him. Telemachus has grown up inside that occupation. He was an infant when Odysseus sailed for Troy. Now he's old enough to defend the household, but he lacks his father's authority, and the suitors still see him as a boy. That makes his search for Odysseus about more than a missing parent. He's searching for proof that his family still has a future. Penelope faces an even crueler bind. If Odysseus lives, remarriage betrays him. If he died years ago, endless waiting may ruin her household and her son. She survives through delay, through strategy, through the famous weaving trick. She tells the suitors she'll choose a husband once she finishes a burial shroud for Laertes. Each day she weaves, each night she quietly unravels it. That isn't passive waiting, it's political resistance conducted with thread. Nolan presents Ithaca as the destination. Homer reveals that home has become another battlefield. The voyage looks like a string of unrelated nightmares. The Lotus Eaters, the Cyclops, Circe, the Underworld, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the Cattle of the Sun, Calypso. But each encounter tests a different part of Odysseus. The Lotus tests whether memory can be surrendered. The Cyclops tests intelligence and pride. Circe tests appetite and self-control. The Underworld forces Odysseus to face death before he can reach home. The Sirens test his hunger for forbidden knowledge. Scylla tests what kind of leader he becomes when some deaths seem unavoidable. The Cattle of Helios test whether his authority can survive starvation. Calypso tests whether home still matters when he's offered an escape from mortality itself. Nolan gives these episodes a darker unity. They aren't just monsters scattered along a route, they become variations on the same question. What has war turned Odysseus into? The Cyclops shows this most clearly. Odysseus enters the cave expecting hospitality. Instead, Polyphemus eats his guests. Odysseus answers with one of the poem's most famous deceptions. He tells the Cyclops his name is Nobody. When Polyphemus screams that nobody is attacking him, the other Cyclopes ignore his cries. The trick works. Odysseus blinds him and escapes beneath the giant's sheep. He has won. Then, pride undoes the victory. From the safety of his ship, Odysseus reveals his real name, wanting the Cyclops to know exactly who defeated him. Polyphemus calls on Poseidon, and that single boast turns one clean escape into years of suffering. Nolan trims or removes much of the verbal trick. His Cyclops becomes less conversational, more purely physical terror, and that sharpens the horror, but it dulls one of Homer's clearest ideas. Odysseus isn't ruined because his intelligence fails. He's ruined because intelligence can't control ego. And before we decide whether Nolan actually changed that idea, we need to ask a more basic question. What kind of poem was Homer's Odyssey in the first place? Homer is one of the most famous names in literature. It's also nearly everything we can confidently say about him. Ancient traditions describe a blind poet. Different Greek cities claimed him as their own. Later biographies invented teachers, journeys, rivalries, and dramatic deaths. None of it gives us a verifiable historical life. Scholars still debate whether one poet shaped both the Iliad and the Odyssey, how much material came from earlier singers, and how long the poems stayed fluid before written versions locked them in place. What's clearer is the tradition behind them. These stories were built for oral performance. A singer worked with inherited formulas, repeated scenes, familiar descriptions, rhythmic patterns. Dawn returned in the same recognizable language, book after book. Ships received the same kinds of description. Heroes carried stock phrases that helped the singer fit names and actions into the meter. That doesn't mean the poet mechanically repeated a memorized script. The tradition supplied building blocks, and a skilled performer could shape them into an enormous narrative. That matters because the Odyssey is itself built like a story about storytelling. The surviving poem runs to 24 books, but it doesn't open with Odysseus's departure from Troy. The first 4 books follow Telemachus as he travels to the men who returned from the war and asks what they know about his father. Only in Book 5 do we finally meet Odysseus, trapped with Calypso, escaping on a raft, reaching the Phaeacians. Then the structure turns inward. Odysseus sits before an audience and narrates most of his famous adventures as one long flashback. The Cyclops, Circe, the Underworld, the Sirens, Scylla, Charybdis, the Cattle of Helios. These are mostly stories Odysseus tells about himself, and that raises a question Nolan largely removes. Can we trust him? Odysseus is a brilliant liar. Once he's back on Ithaca, he invents elaborate false identities and adjusts his story for whoever happens to be listening. Even Athena admires how well he deceives people. Homer doesn't always park an invisible camera beside Odysseus. Often, he gives us Odysseus's own performance instead. The greatest storyteller inside the Odyssey may also be its least reliable witness. But the poem carries another kind of layering underneath. Its heroes are traditionally tied to the late Bronze Age, a world of Mycenaean palaces, bronze weapons, fortified citadels, long-distance trade, kings backed by organized palace bureaucracies. Yet the poem took literary shape centuries later. By then, the Mycenaean palace system had already collapsed. The linear B script used by palace officials had vanished, and political structures, weapons, and burial customs had all changed. So Homer's world isn't a clean photograph of one historical century. It's a layered memory. Some details likely preserve Bronze Age tradition. Others reflect the world of later Greek singers, and others belong entirely to heroic imagination. There was also a real city at the site, now called Hisarlik, occupied, destroyed, and rebuilt more than once. Late Bronze Age Troy sat inside the wider world of Anatolia and the Aegean. But archaeology can't prove Homer's complete war. It can't prove Helen caused it. It can't prove Achilles killed Hector. And it can't prove a wooden horse ever entered the city. A conflict over Troy would still make political sense on its own terms. The city stood near routes that mattered, connecting the Aegean to the Straits. Trade, tribute, piracy, and regional alliances are more plausible causes for war than one abducted queen. Then came the wider Bronze Age crisis. Palaces fell, trade networks broke down, populations moved, some cities burned, and others faded gradually. Egyptian inscriptions describe several groups arriving or attacking from the sea, and modern historians file these groups under one label: Sea Peoples. But that label can mislead. They may not have shared a single identity at all. Some were probably raiders, others mercenaries, migrants, refugees, displaced communities. They can't simply be blamed for bringing down the entire Eastern Mediterranean world by themselves. Nolan uses this uncertainty brilliantly. His Odysseus may not literally be one of the Sea Peoples, but he stands in for a chilling possibility. The hero returning home, seen from one side, is the invader destroying homes, seen from the other. Troy was real. Bronze Age warfare was real. The collapse was real. Odysseus remains unverified. And Homer's poem stands between those worlds, not as an eyewitness record, but as inherited memory transformed into song. Beneath the gods and monsters, the Odyssey keeps testing one social law: Xenia. It's usually translated as hospitality or guest friendship. A stranger arrives at your door. You give him food, shelter, protection, and only afterward do you ask his identity and his purpose. The guest, in turn, has to respect the household, and the bond can last between families for generations. This isn't just good manners. In a world without hotels, passports, embassies, or international law, hospitality is what creates trust between distant communities. A traveler may be powerless, but he may also be watched over by Zeus, and any stranger could be a god in disguise. The Cyclops breaks Xenia by eating his guests. Circe breaks it at first by transforming hers. The Phaeacians practice it almost perfectly. They feed Odysseus, listen to his story, give him gifts, and carry him home. The suitors commit the longest violation of all. They enter Odysseus's palace as guests, then consume his wealth, threaten his son, pressure his wife, and plot to seize the household for good. That's what makes their punishment feel earned inside Homer's moral world. But Nolan points the same accusation back at Odysseus. The Greeks entered Troy through an object presented as sacred, using trust as the tool to destroy the city from inside. The suitors violate one household. Odysseus helped violate an entire civilization. That comparison transforms the hero. The opening of the poem calls him Polytropos, a word with no clean English equivalent. Many-turning, much-traveled, resourceful, versatile, devious. A man hard to pin down. That ambiguity is Odysseus. He's brave and reckless, protective and dangerous, loyal to home but unfaithful during his absence. A gifted leader whose decisions keep costing lives. A victim of divine hostility who also manufactures many of his own disasters. The Sirens expose another side of him. Odysseus doesn't simply avoid their song, he wants to hear it. He orders his crew to plug their own ears, then has them tie him to the mast, building himself a system that lets him experience forbidden knowledge without having to obey it. It's brilliant. It's also selfish. His men have to row through the danger while he gets to receive the revelation. Scylla forces an even harsher choice. Odysseus knows the monster will seize several men and doesn't fully warn them, steering the ship forward because he believes losing a few is better than losing everyone. Maybe that's leadership. Maybe it's betrayal. Homer doesn't hand us a flawless hero. He gives us a man whose greatest gifts are wired straight into his greatest dangers. Nolan sharpens that tension further. His central question isn't whether Odysseus can beat the monsters. It's whether a man shaped by deception and slaughter can make it home without dragging those forces in behind him. Nolan keeps the recognizable stations of the voyage, but he keeps changing what those stations mean. Homer's Calypso holds Odysseus for 7 years and offers him immortality. Odysseus still longs for Penelope and home. Nolan ties Calypso more directly to forgetting. The temptation isn't just eternal life, it's freedom from a memory that won't let go. Homer's Circe turns men into pigs through magic, and Hermes arms Odysseus against her spell. Nolan keeps the transformation, but pushes the scene toward moral symbolism. The men don't just become animals, their appetite reveals what was already sitting inside them. Homer's Laestrygonians are cannibal giants. Nolan gives them a more militarized physical presence. Homer's Athena is an independent goddess who argues with Zeus, makes her own plans, changes appearance at will, and protects Odysseus for reasons entirely her own. Nolan's Athena may be divine, but she may also be memory, conscience, or the face of a victim Odysseus can't forget. Homer gives the Phaeacians a major role, the ideal hosts, the audience for Odysseus's story, the ones who finally carry him to Ithaca. And by shrinking that frame, Nolan makes the voyage feel more immediate, but he also drops the question of whether Odysseus is performing his identity for an audience. Nolan gives Sinon a prominent role in the fall of Troy. Sinon belongs to the wider Trojan tradition and becomes especially important in later retellings of the horse, letting Nolan dramatize a deception Homer mostly leaves to memory and recollection. But the biggest change happens at home. Penelope announces the contest of the bow. The suitors have to string Odysseus's weapon, then fire an arrow through 12 axe heads. They fail. The disguised king succeeds. The massacre begins. But Homer gives Penelope one more test after that. She orders their marriage bed moved. Odysseus reacts instantly. The bed can't be moved because he built it around a living olive tree rooted inside the house. Only the real Odysseus could know that secret. Penelope hasn't just waited for him. She's outthought the master of deception, building a trap only her husband could ever escape. The rooted bed also stands for their marriage. The house was built around it, and their shared identity grew from something living and fixed beneath the ground. Nolan replaces or downplays that recognition device. The choice may look cleaner on screen, but it strips out one of the poem's clearest proofs that Penelope is Odysseus's intellectual equal. The film also softens some of the homecoming's ugliest violence. In Homer, women accused of siding with or sleeping with the suitors are forced to clean the hall, then killed. That episode sits uneasily with modern readers, and cutting it makes the returning hero easier to root for. But it also makes Homer's actual ending less disturbing than it really is. And Homer doesn't end when the suitors die. Their relatives gather for revenge, Ithaca edges towards civil war, and Odysseus has come home only to spark another conflict. Athena finally steps in and orders both sides to stand down. Homer ends by forcing peace before revenge can swallow another generation. Nolan chooses a different final note. His ending pushes Odysseus toward continued reckoning. The voyage doesn't end just because Ithaca has been reached. The sea remains. The dead remain. Troy remains. That answers the question the Trojan Horse raised in the first place. Homer uses the horse as one remembered proof of Odysseus's cunning. Nolan makes it the wound underneath the entire film. Homer asks whether the man of many identities can still be recognized at home. Nolan asks whether a man who destroyed another home deserves to reclaim his own. Homer's universe runs on real, active, dangerous gods. Nolan's runs on memory, violence, and consequence. Nolan keeps the root, but he changes the moral destination. If this story matters to you, share it with someone who thinks they already know the Odyssey, because the version they learned in school isn't the version Nolan made, and it probably isn't the version Homer's first audiences heard either.